Picture this. You have got a patch of pure gravel. Maybe it is an old driveway, maybe it is a path, maybe it is a load of crushed stone or builder's rubble somebody dumped and never cleared, gray, loose, bone dry, with no soil in sight. And every gardener, every website, every neighbor over the fence tells you the exact same thing. That is not a garden, that is a driveway. Nothing roots in bare stone. You would have to barrow the whole lot away and bring in tons of topsoil before you could grow a single thing. And on that exact bare gravel, I am going to show you 7 vegetables you can grow so well you would stop buying them, counted down to the one that turns the whole thing on its head, because here is what almost nobody believes. There is a whole side of the vegetable shop that does not just cope with pure gravel, it actively grows better in it than it ever would in rich, heavy, wet soil, healthier and sweeter, because the sharp drainage and the banked warmth are exactly what it was built for. There are crops that would rot in a wet, heavy bed, but sit perfectly happy sunk into stone. And here is the one that stops most gardeners dead: the long, straight roots, the carrots and the parsnips that fork and stunt in heavy ground, grow long, clean, and sweet in deep, gritty gravel. So the very crop the heavy soil kills is the crop the gravel grows best. Let me show you the fast one first, because it is the moment it flips in your head. On the exact ground everyone told you to dig up and cart away, you crouch down at your gravel bed and you cut a handful of fresh, fragrant herbs, thyme and rosemary and oregano, loving the sharp, dry, sun-warmed stone, and beside them you pull a fat head of garlic and a bunch of long, clean carrots straight up out of the grit. Herbs, garlic, and carrots off a bare driveway. That is not a fantasy, and it is not a trick. A patch of loose gray gravel looks like the deadest ground you could ever try to farm, but it is quietly sitting on 3 gifts a heavy, wet, cold soil fights all year to give. And I will be honest with you in one sentence up front: gravel is not soil. So you plant into pockets and beds of compost among the stone rather than scattering seed on bare grit, and you skip the thirsty, heavy feeders that want constant wet feet. Everything else on this list runs on exactly what gravel offers. Because the drainage and heat side of the shopping, the herbs, the garlic and onions, the roots, the tomatoes and peppers, the perennials, the potatoes, and the fruit, does not just tolerate pure gravel, it thrives on it. Because the gravel already beats a heavy soil at the 3 things that quietly matter most for these crops. It drains perfectly, so nothing ever waterlogs or rots, and the crops that hate wet feet stay high and dry. It banks and radiates the sun's heat, so the ground warms early and ripens the heat lovers a cold, wet soil leaves sulking, and it only needs planting into, not replacing, because you drop your crops into pockets of compost among the stone, and the gravel becomes a permanent, weed-smothering, poor, moisture-locking mulch that all but waters them for you. Give the gravel the crops that were made for it instead of fighting it with the ones that were not, and it grows. So here is the countdown: 7 vegetables you can grow in pure gravel and stop buying, starting at number 7 with the fastest win of the lot. Number 7 is the fastest proof the gravel works, and it is the crop that quietly thrives on the very thing everyone thinks makes gravel useless: salad leaves and Mediterranean herbs. I am starting here because most people look at a dry gravel bed and assume nothing green could ever want to live in it, and they never learn that the sharp drainage and the stored warmth are exactly what these crops crave most. The Mediterranean herbs, thyme, rosemary, sage, oregano, and marjoram, come from hot, dry, stony hillsides, and they are miserable in rich, wet, heavy ground. They rot at the root and the flavor goes flat and watery. Pure gravel is their idea of home. And the quick cut and come again salad leaves, rocket, loose leaf lettuce, land cress, and the like race away in the warm, free draining pockets and give you a cutting bowl in a few weeks. So you plant your herbs and your leaves into fists of compost raked into the gravel, and that is the whole job. Here is why the gravel wins for these, and it is the surprise that sets up the whole video. The sharp drainage keeps the roots from ever sitting cold and wet, so the herbs never rot, and, better still, the lean, dry, sun-warmed ground concentrates their oils, so gravel-grown thyme and rosemary are actually more fragrant and more flavorsome than the soft, sappy, overwatered stuff, the herbs the shop sells you in tiny plastic packets for a small fortune. And the trick most people miss: harvest, cut, and come again, taking only the outer leaves and the top sprigs, and leaving the plant growing, so one planting hands you leaves and herbs for months, not one handful. A gravel bed of leaves and herbs hands you your first homegrown crop, fresh cutting salad and fragrant herbs off the exact ground everyone swore was a dead driveway, in a matter of weeks. But if leaves and herbs are the fastest thing you can grow off that gravel, the next number is the staple crop that would rot in a wet, heavy bed and sits perfectly happy sunk into stone. Number 6 is the crop that hates wet feet. Number 6 is the family of everyday staples that fails more often from wet, heavy ground than from anything else, and that pure gravel solves at a stroke: the alliums, onions, garlic, and shallots. Here is the honest bit that makes this number, and it is what most people get wrong. Onions and garlic do not die of drought nearly as often as they die of sitting cold and wet. In a heavy, waterlogged soil, they rot in the ground and the bulbs go soft and moldy before you ever lift them. Garlic especially wants to be planted in autumn and to sit dry-footed all winter, and a wet, heavy bed is exactly what kills it. Pure gravel is the perfect answer because it drains so hard and fast that the bulbs never sit wet for a moment. They stay firm, clean, and healthy right through to harvest. So you plant your onion sets, your garlic cloves, and your shallots into pockets of compost among the gravel, and the stone does the rest. Here is why the gravel wins, and it is the clever part down in the soil. That same sharp drainage and stored warmth ripens and cures the bulbs beautifully, firming them up so they store for months in the shed instead of going soft, which is the whole point of growing your own onions and garlic. And they ask almost nothing of you. You plant them and largely walk away. A single strip of gravel planted up with alliums can hand you strings of onions, heads of garlic, and clumps of shallots, the exact everyday staples that go into nearly every meal you cook, all cured hard and storing for months off ground everyone else wrote off as a driveway. But the next number is the one that flips the whole series on its head, the crop that heavy soil famously ruins and that pure gravel grows better than almost anywhere. Number 5 is the crop the clay killed. Number 5 is the one that flips it completely, the crop that a heavy soil forks, stunts, and ruins, and that pure gravel grows long, clean, and sweet, the root crops, carrots, parsnips, and beetroot. If you have grown roots in a heavy, stony, or lumpy soil, you know the heartbreak. You lift a carrot and it has split into 3 stubby forked fingers, wrapped itself around a stone, or gone hairy and misshapen because a long straight root cannot push cleanly through heavy cloddy ground. Here is the surprise that makes this number. What a carrot or a parsnip actually wants is a deep, loose, open, free-draining bed with no obstruction, and a gravel plot, planted the right way, gives it exactly that. You do not sow carrots into raw, sharp gravel. You make a deep pocket or a raised drill of loose, sieved, stone-free compost sunk into the gravel bed, or you build a deep bed on top, and the root drives straight down through that soft column, while the gravel underneath gives it the sharp drainage it loves. Here is why the gravel wins, and it is the whole payoff of the number. That free-draining, stone-managed, sun-warmed ground grows carrots and parsnips longer, straighter, cleaner, and sweeter than a heavy, wet soil ever could, and beetroot swells fat and tender in the warm, open grit, the exact roots you buy by the bag every week. A deep gravel bed of roots can hand you sweet carrots, long parsnips, and fat beetroot, pulled clean and unforked out of ground that everyone told you would grow nothing at all, and the one crop a heavy soil butchers is the crop the gravel grows best of all. But the next number is the group that treats sun-baked gravel like a private heat store and gorges on the warmth. Number 4 is the crop that gorges on the heat. Number 4 is the crop that turns the one thing gravel does that no soil can into a glut of the most rebought summer veg there is, the heat lovers, tomatoes, peppers, and chilies. If there is one group of crops that can cash in on gravel's stored warmth, it is this one. Tomatoes, peppers, chilies, and aubergines come from hot places. They need warmth to set fruit, to swell it, and above all to ripen it, and in a cold, wet, heavy soil they sit there green, sulking, and slow, half of them never coloring up before the season ends. Here is why the gravel wins, and it is the payoff that makes this number. A gravel bed is a heat store. The stone soaks up the sun all day and radiates it back in the evening and holds the warmth late into the autumn, so the ground around those roots runs warmer and longer than any open soil, which is precisely the growing heat these crops need to gorge, swell, and ripen. Plant them into generous pockets of rich compost sunk into the warm gravel. Keep them fed and watered through the fruiting rush, because these ones do drink and stand back. Here is the spike. A few tomato plants and a row of peppers and chilies on warm gravel can ripen you trusses of tomatoes, a steady pick of peppers, and more chilies than you know what to do with, all through the summer and later into the autumn, than a cold bed would ever manage. The exact expensive summer veg you rebuy by the punnet, grown off ground that was written off as a driveway, and the gravel throws the sun's heat back up under the trusses to color them faster. You have turned the dead-looking stone into the warmest, most productive corner of the plot. But the next number is the genuinely surprising one, the crop that does not just tolerate gravel, it actively prefers the sharp-drained stone, and it comes back every single year on its own. Number 3 is the one that prefers the stone. Number 3 is the one that flips it completely, because these are not crops that merely put up with gravel. They actively want the sharp-drained, stony ground, the perennial crops, led by asparagus. Here is the whole secret and the reason to grow them on purpose in the stone. Asparagus is a long-lived perennial that will crop every spring for 20 years or more, and the single thing it cannot stand is wet feet. A heavy, waterlogged soil rots its crowns and finishes the bed in a season or two. What asparagus wants above all is deep, sharp, free-draining, sandy or gritty ground, which is why the classic advice is to plant it on a raised ridge, and a gravel bed gives it exactly that drainage for free, so it sits high, dry, and happy and crops for decades. And asparagus is not alone. The globe artichoke, a big architectural perennial that hands you fat, edible heads every year, thrives in warm, sharp-drained ground and sulks in cold, wet clay. The perennial Mediterranean herbs, rosemary, sage, and thyme, settle in and grow into permanent, fragrant bushes. Even perennial strawberries love the warm, gritty, free-draining pockets. Here is why the gravel wins, and it is the surprise that makes the whole video worth watching. These are permanent crops. They put their roots down deep once and stay, and the sharp-drained, sun-warmed stone is the one thing that lets them survive the winters that rot them out of a heavy soil, so they crop for you year after year with almost nothing from you, no replanting, no digging, no yearly bill. Rake back a pocket, plant your asparagus crowns on a ridge, your artichoke, your perennial herbs, and largely leave them. Here is the spike. A single gravel corner of perennials can hand you spears of asparagus every spring, artichoke heads through the summer, and fragrant herbs all year, coming back on its own from the ground you were told to cart away. A permanent larder, planted once, off bare stone. But if the perennials are the surprise, the last two numbers are the heavy hitters, the two that actually earn the word never. Number 2 is the heavy staple that grows on top of the stone. Before I count down the last two, stop and look at what that bare gravel is already holding. a bed of cutting salad and fragrant herbs off the sharp, warm stone, strings of onions and heads of garlic cured hard where a wet bed would have rotted them, long, clean carrots and parsnips pulled unforked out of the grit, trusses of tomatoes and peppers ripening in the banked heat, and a permanent corner of asparagus and perennials that actually prefer the stone. That is already the freshest and some of the most expensive corners of the cart, all grown on pure gravel that everybody told you would grow nothing at all, and the last two numbers are the heavy hitters, the two that turn the whole idea on its head, the heavy staple you lug home in a sack, grown straight on top of the stone with no soil at all, and at number one, the crop that roots best of all in poor, hot, stony ground and hands you a lifetime larder off the dead driveway. Quick question while we are here, and I do read every reply. Have you got a patch of gravel or a stony driveway going spare, and what is the one crop you always assumed bare stone would kill? Tell me in the comments, I am genuinely curious. Now number two. Number two is the heavy, filling, staple crop that most people never dream they could grow on bare stone, and that you grow with no digging and no soil stripping at all, the potato, and Maincrop potatoes above all. Here is the honest bit that makes this the perfect number two. You do not plant these down in the gravel, you grow them on it, the no-dig way, which turns a bare stone surface into a potato patch without moving a single barrow of rubble. You lay your seed potatoes straight onto the gravel or onto a sheet of cardboard over it, and you heap a thick, deep mound of compost, straw, or well-rotted mulch over the top, and the potatoes grow up through that mound while their roots hunt down into the free-draining stone below. Here is why the gravel wins, and it is the clever part. Potatoes hate sitting in cold, wet, waterlogged ground where they rot and go to slug, and the sharp draining gravel underneath means the water always runs away so the crop stays clean and healthy, while the loose mound above means you never dig, you just pull the mulch back and pick the potatoes off the surface. Here is the spike. One deep mound of Maincrop potatoes grown on gravel can hand you a sack of a heavy, filling staple that stores for months, the exact potatoes you lug home from the shop trip after trip, grown on top of a surface that had no soil in it at all, harvested clean with your hands and no fork. The heaviest, most rebought corner of the whole cart, grown off a driveway, no digging required. But the crop at number one is the one that flips the whole idea in your head, the heaviest, most permanent payoff of all, that roots best of any crop in the poor, hot, stony ground everyone told you to clear away. Here is number one. Number one is the heaviest, most permanent, most expensive payoff you can grow, and the one that pure gravel is genuinely best of all for, the fruit, led by figs and grapes. Here is why it is the perfect number one, and it is the fact that turns the whole dead ground idea completely inside out. The finest fruit in the world is grown on poor, hot, stony ground on purpose. Every great vineyard on earth sits on lean, sharp-drained, sun-baked stone, because a grapevine that has to fight a little for water and sits in banked warmth ripens sweeter, richer fruit than a vine in a rich, wet, easy soil ever could. The fig is the same story. A fig actually fruits best when its roots are restricted and its ground is poor, hot and sharp draining. Plant one in rich wet soil and it throws all leaf and little fruit. Plant it in a hot gravel corner against a wall and it crops heavily. And the soft fruit follows. Strawberries and alpine strawberries love the warm, gritty, free-draining pockets, and the gravel keeps their fruit clean and off the wet ground where it would rot. The one thing to get right is simple. You plant your tree, your vine, or your bushes into a good pocket of soil to get them started, and then the gravel does everything else, the drainage, the warmth, and the weed control. Plant a fig against a warm wall, a grapevine along a fence, a few strawberries in the pockets, mulch them, and largely leave them. Here is the payoff I opened the whole video on, the one that flips it in your head. A fig, a vine, and a patch of strawberries on hot gravel can hand you armfuls of fresh figs, bunches of sweet grapes, and bowls of strawberries every year, for decades, off the exact ground you were told to barrow away, the single most expensive, most permanent corner of the whole shopping, and it grows better on the poor stony ground than it ever would in good soil. That is number one, and that is the countdown. Now here is how you run all 7 so it actually replaces the shopping instead of just surviving on bad ground. Here is the part that ties 7 crops into one working garden instead of 7 separate beds, and it is the reason a patch of pure gravel can genuinely keep you out of the vegetable aisle. The whole thing comes down to one idea. You do not force soil onto the gravel. You match the crop to it and you plant into it instead of replacing it. Pure gravel hands you 3 gifts a heavy, wet, cold soil fights all year to give. It drains perfectly so nothing rots. It banks and radiates heat so your crops ripen early and late, and it is a permanent weed-smothering mulch you plant straight into, and it is genuinely poor at exactly one thing, holding water and food for the thirsty heavy feeders that drink and eat constantly. So the system is 4 simple rules. First, grow the drainage and heat lovers, not the bog crops. Fill the ground with herbs, alliums, roots, tomatoes and peppers, asparagus and perennials, potatoes and fruit, the whole side of the shopping that actually wants sharp, warm, free-draining ground. And do not waste the gravel fighting to grow thirsty, hungry crops like celery or thirsty summer squash that were only ever going to sulk without constant water. Grow those few in a rich, moisture-holding bed or a big tub instead. Second, this is the big one, plant into the gravel. Do not try to replace it. Rake back a pocket and drop in a fist of compost, or lay a bed of good soil straight on top and let the gravel become a permanent mulch underneath, because it smothers weeds, locks the moisture in below where the roots are, and drains every drop of excess away, all for free, from the stone you already have. Third, give each crop its start, then let the gravel take over. Everything on this list wants a pocket or a bed of decent compost to root into at the beginning, so make that pocket generous, and after that the sharp drainage and the stored heat do most of the work, and you water far less than you would ever water an open bed. Fourth, use the warmth and the walls, the heat lovers and the fruit crop hardest against a sunny wall or fence where the gravel and the stone throw the most banked heat back at them, so plant your figs, vines, tomatoes, and peppers where the sun sits longest. Do those 4 things, and a bare gravel plot turns into the warmest, sharpest drained, lowest watering, most weed-free ground you will ever grow on, which is the only way 7 crops add up to a real dent in the shopping. And one quiet bonus of gravel you will come to love. Once your crops are rooted through it, a gravel garden is one of the most drought-proof, low-watering plots there is, holding its moisture down in the cool stone while a heavy open bed bakes and cracks in a dry summer. So that is the countdown, 7 vegetables you can grow in pure gravel and stop buying. Fast-cutting salad and fragrant Mediterranean herbs off the warm, sharp stone, strings of onions and garlic cured hard where a wet bed would rot them, long, clean carrots and parsnips that a heavy soil would only fork, trusses of tomatoes and peppers gorging on the banked heat, a permanent corner of asparagus and perennials that actually prefer the stone, the heavy staple Maincrop potatoes grown right on top of the gravel, and at number 1 the figs, grapes, and soft fruit that root best of all in poor hot stony ground and pay you back for decades. This channel is called 1 Acre Blueprint, and by now the real lesson is clear. The blueprint was never really about the acre, and it was never about having good, deep, easy soil. It is about how hard each square foot works, and a patch of bare, gray, written-off gravel planted with the crops that were built for it instead of the ones that were not, and planted into instead of replaced, can keep a family out of the vegetable aisle year after year. Do not try to build all 7 at once. Start with 1 this week, a pocket of cutting salad and herbs for a crop in a few weeks, a few garlic cloves pushed into the grit this autumn that will hand you heads next summer, or a single fig or grapevine against a warm wall that will feed you for decades. Subscribe to stay on the 1 acre blueprint, because next we take this exact idea somewhere else the world swears nothing grows, and the crops that quietly prove them wrong, and tell me in the comments, of these 7, which would you grow in your gravel first?